long range, and I'm going to start that story with how bullets are designed for long range, all right? So the first thing you got to do before you get all excited about a super high BC bullet that's going to just blow everything out of the water is you have to understand the constraints of the design, all right? Does the bullet have to be magazine fed when it's loaded in certain cartridges? Does it have to stabilize in certain twist rates? Just basically finding the edges of the design envelope and understanding that, and then making the best design that's possible within those constraints. It doesn't matter how good the performance is theoretically on paper if when you shoot it, it comes apart or doesn't do what you're supposed, what you want it to do. So understanding those constraints, we make the best design we can possible within those constraints, and then we start with the Doppler radar testing, and that's really our litmus test for how well something is flying. We can see, obviously what the average performance is, what the shot-to-shot variation is, if there's stability issues, like we can see all those things, and then we feed that back into the design process if necessary and make adjustments to optimize the flight performance beyond what the design was supposed to be. So that's basically how we go through the process of designing and testing and characterizing bullets. As far as hitting targets at long range, it's about bullet selection, right? So what I just described is the inward out view, like how we make the bullets and conceive them. But as for the end user, like how do you pick a bullet, you have to understand your application, right? Because there's a lot of great bullets out there that may not be great for your application. So when I say your application, it's, are you one of the shooters that has a magazine length constraint that a bullet was perhaps optimized for? So understanding those things will help you with bullet selection. And then once you have your bullet and you have your load, as far as hitting targets at long range, a lot of that work is obviously going to be based on your understanding of a ballistic solver, how to input accurate inputs to give you accurate outputs. But even that is not all the work that you need to do. There's still a lot of 100-yard work as far as zeroing the rifle, the tall target test, verifying your scope. There's so many ways to miss targets at long range, but most of those ways are avoidable, and most of those things can be avoided with 100-yard work. And when I say 100-yard work, that's verifying your rifle zero, verifying that your scope tracks the correct amount. So when you dial 30 minutes of angle, are you getting 30.0 or are you getting 31.5 or 28.2? Because not all scopes, believe it or not, track exactly perfect. And beyond that, you've got your cant, right? Your anti-cant device or your level. So at 100 yards, you can determine if you're adjusting your vertical straight up a plumb line or not, and you can verify that on a target. So a lot of the weirdness that you end up seeing at long range is really weirdness at 100 yards, just manifested over distance. So the more of that stuff that you can work out on a tall target at 100 yards, the better position you'll be. In other words, you'll only have the problems that you have to have at long range if you do everything right at 100 yards. So with that, so mostly I cover the deterministic variables, those things that you can measure and correct for with either ballistic solver, chronograph, tall target. Emil talks more about the non-deterministic variables like wind and how to manage those things that you can't measure.
Hey, good morning, guys. So hitting targets, we're really talking about hit percentage, right? Increasing your hit percentage. So all the things that we're doing, sussing out all those deterministic things, the non-deterministic things like the wind especially, you should approach to shooting in the wind like trying to increase your percentage, not as if you're trying to solve an equation. Okay, that's very important. So I'll start off, I think, with something I always say at the beginning of any kind of class or lecture or whatever. You need some things to hit targets. You need a stable platform. You need a platform with like demonstrated, repeated precision. You have to be able to expect it's going to deliver the shot where you think it's going to go, right? You have to have a good solver. You have to have good info in. Most mistakes in ballistic data, it's your fault. You've messed up some input, right? So once that, you have to have all that stuff. You have to have good fundamental elements of marksmanship. So every time you go out to shoot, whether it's to test a load or see if your predictions are working or whatever, you need to spend some time on marksmanship, because none of this matters if you suck.
I suck.
You probably don't, but you can always suck less. all right? So that's important. So spend time on marksmanship. You need to know exactly where those crosshair or those sights were when that trigger moved and it went bang. You need to follow through. You need to call your shot. Especially with wind stuff, you have to know exactly where you shot that round. You have to have been able to call that shot. If Bryan and I are working together on the range and I tell him, hey man, hold right edge of the target, and it actually went like 0.2 mils off the right side of the target, and he shoots it and he hits dead center, I think I'm right with the wind call. And if he doesn't know what he did, then we're actually both wrong for the next shot, all right? That constant feedback loop. The other thing is your mindset is so important when you're shooting in the wind. Like a mental management thing in any kind of competition, you should not let the event happen to you. You are happening to the event. You have to stay in the moment. If you look at great performers, whether it's golf or tennis or any sport or any activity, those guys are in the moment the entire time. And that's how you have to be in the wind. I've seen it many times out working with guys. You climb a mountain and you lay down and you get your bipods and you have one bipod on a rock and one elbow's over here and you're trying to make sure your rifle is level. You're looking at your bubble or your anti-cant device and you're like, what's the range of the target? And the guy says, oh, it's whatever. And you're like, okay, what's my dope? And the guy, you look up and that's the first time someone thinks about the wind. You are screwed, man. You're gonna hit Jack and shit and Jack just left town. So stay in the moment all the time. So that aggressive mindset, when you're aggressive like that, it actually helps you, raises your awareness in general. If you're in that moment, so you get out of the car instantly, like you're looking at the tops of trees, you're looking at the grass moving, you're trying to put metrics on everything that you can see. And you're gonna be so much better prepared for when you lay down and shoot. It's like if you're walking on a trail in the woods and you're only looking down here and you bump into somebody walking the other way, it's because you're not up and looking around. That's the same thing with the wind. So that is a really, really important thing. It's probably more important than how I focus my spotting scope to see the mirage, honestly, right? So mental mindset, staying in the moment, maintaining that sort of aggressive, leaning forward mindset. So putting a number on a condition is a relatively simple thing. If you want to know how bullets drift, the mechanism of wind drift, you should read Bryan's book, right? Because he does a really good job explaining the physics of why a bullet drifts, how much it drifts, concepts such as lag time, external ballistic concepts. They're really important to kind of understand because it can help you maybe choose which bullet you want to shoot for your application, whatever. But beyond that, we're really down to speed and direction, right? So when I first started shooting, I was at a 1,000-yard match shooting M14s at a range, and I asked one of the old Army sergeants on the team, and I asked him, hey, how much wind is out there? And he's like, man, that's like 13 minutes. I'm like, okay, why? He goes, well, it just is. I'm like, well, why? He goes, well, it looks like it. See, when that flag is doing that and when the mirage is doing like that, that's whatever. I'm like, well, how did you figure it out? He goes, well, man, you just got to remember it and you'll learn it. I'm like, well, I don't want to wait. I'm going to beat you right now. So how do I know the number right now? So my process is pretty simple. I put a number on the speed and then I use a couple of different techniques to figure out the direction of the wind. So I'll kind of, So he asked where you are downrange, is that right? I'll kind of go through that a little bit. So, obviously your first input is like where you're at, right? The skill set of determining the wind without a device, I cannot overstate how important that is. Without using a Kestrel, you should be able to, by visual stuff, if the wind's under 10, 12 miles an hour, and you have some inputs, you can see some leaves, some grass, trees, whatever, you should be able to put a number on the wind within about 1 mile an hour. It's not hard. You just have to practice. That is the one thing you have to practice. If you open any marksmanship manual from like 1962, there's a list of stuff like smoke is drifting, that's 2 to 3 miles an hour. You can feel the wind on your face, it's whatever. You see a tree move, it's whatever. That list of stuff is great for wherever you're at, right? There were some guys here yesterday who are like in Saskatchewan and they shoot up on the plains of like northern Canada. And the only thing that's alive on these plains like is that tall, because everything else has been blown over by 40 mile an hour winds, right? But so in that environment, there's a list of stuff. You got to figure it out. I was shooting an ELR match in Texas a couple years ago, and one of the guys on the applied ballistics team, he's like, we see some dust. I mean, the wind was just gusting. You see the dust just kick up, and he's like 21 miles an hour. I'm like, what? No way, dude. He's like, I promise you, that's 21 miles an hour. He goes, I've actually been looking at this sand for like a month. And I've been watching it, and I know whenever the sand gets raised up off the ground, that's 21. I'm like, you're full of it. So I took my Kestrel, went out there and stood next to this stuff, and a big gust came, and the sand kicked up. I looked at my Kestrel, and it said 21. He had like figured it out, right? I was on a runway one time, and I'm like, the wind was gusting, so I put my Kestrel up like this, and I closed my eyes, and I kind of just stood up straight. You know, every once in a while you have a gust of wind, like maybe kind of takes you off your feet, right? So I'm holding the Kestrel, and every time it did that, I looked at the Kestrel, and it was right around 14 miles an hour. So I knew that when I felt that gust, that buffet, it was like at least 14 or 15 mile an hour. So all those things, man, you can learn it. It's really important because we have great tools for wind speed, Kestrels, anemometers. There's guys now with these ultrasonic wind meters. They're like, you know, omnidirectional, you can communicate, you know, a couple thousand meters with these things. You can instrument a whole range, right? Pretty badass. But if you don't have that ability to interrogate the wind speed downrange, all you have is this, right? So wind speed. Wind direction, you know, without getting too technical, because we don't really have a lot of time to do this, but, you know, how much the percentage of the wind that affects your bullet is the direction, right? So it's a percentage. And there's lots of stuff out there, like in Bryan, if you go Bryan's book, he's got percentages. I have a kind of a rough, I do the wind in every half an hour. If you want to know what those percentages are, if you're going straight ahead, that's 0 degrees, right? You type in the cosine of 0 is 0. Half an hour, 1230, that's 15 degrees. 15 degrees, type in the cosine. That's your percentage of wind. It's like 0.25. 1 o'clock wind, type in the cosine of 30. It's like 0.5, right? So you should be a good wind reader. To be an elite wind reader, I think you should be able to figure out the direction of the wind within half an hour on the clock. If you can do that and figure out the speed of the wind within about 2 miles an hour, there's not a lot of targets you won't hit, okay? So how do you find the direction? For me, the technique that I use the most is with optics. So we all kind of know, we've seen what mirage is, or the Brits say mirage. So that's like the heat waves or whatever you want to call it. Basically, it's light refracting through layers of air, right? You know, you hold up a water bottle, everything on the other side of the water bottle is distorted. Same kind of effect happens to air because it's sort of at different densities. And that's what the mirage is. So when the wind blows, you can, in a very rough terms, you can see at least which direction the wind is. If you see the mirage kind of moving this way or moving this way, never mind how fast the wind is blowing by looking at mirage. That is one of those skills that you do have to spend a lot of time to figure it out. But if I know that the mirage is going straight up or a boil, that means that the wind is either blowing directly into my face or directly from behind me, right? So what I'll do typically is I'll come out on a new range and I'll go, okay, I see the trees, Kestrel, wind is going about X miles per hour or meters per second or whatever you want to use. And then I'll look around like, I think the wind looks like it's coming from somewhere over there. So I'll take my optic and I'll look downrange at my target and I'm like, yeah, sure enough, I see some mirage moving in this general direction. And I will take my optic, binos, spotting scope, whatever, and I will turn into the wind until I find the boil. Because if the wind's coming from that coast sign there, and I feel it over here, and I look through my scope at the target, I see the mirage doing this. If I turn my binos, and when I finally get in line with the wind, I see a mirage, boil. Now I know exactly which direction the wind is. And I mean, you could get as sort of in the details with that as much as you want. I mean, in some ELR matches, I've taken a compass, I've shot an azimuth, magnetic azimuth at the target, and I'll turn my spotting scope until I find the boil, then I'll shoot an azimuth at the boil. And I'll figure out the difference of the delta of those two azimuths. So if it was like 0 degrees magnetic toward the target, and I see the boil at 49 degrees magnetic, I'll actually take my calculator and type in 49 and hit the cosine button. That's the actual percentage of the wind, right? You don't always have to do that. You probably shouldn't always do that. Matter of fact, if you do that and I see you doing it, I'll probably make fun of you. But you can, but that's the mechanism of direction. And I think by far it is the most accurate way to find out the direction of the wind. So speed, direction. Remember, everything is about hit percentage, right? So you should only do the least amount of work to hit a target than you have to. So like, if you're shooting F-class at 1,000 yards, you've got a 1 minute of angle 10 ring. You have a half minute of angle X ring. That's a small ass target, right? So to get in right in the middle of that target, you might have to really figure out your inputs. But if I'm shooting at a 300 meter full-size IPSC with a 308, it's about 18, 19 inches across. It takes about 20 miles an hour of wind to blow a bullet like 19 inches at 300 meters, like a 175 Burger. It's a lot of wind. So if I'm out there shooting and I'm just trying to hit that target, do I have to do anything? If the wind is below 20 miles an hour, do I have to do anything else except aim at the upwind edge of the target? Nope, you don't. So you should you can use a Kestrel, you can use a solver to figure out how wide your target is in wind. That's a really, really good thing to know before you shoot something. How wide is that target? That gives you a couple things. It tells you what kind of variance in the wind you can get away with without having to change your point of aim. You can actually use that target as like a wind measurement tool. If I know the target's 4 miles per hour of wind across, which means that it takes 4 miles an hour of wind of drift to give me the width of that target, I know if, hey, the wind doubles, I just double my hold one target right? So you can do a lot of that stuff before you even go out to the range or competition or hunt or anything. Have sort of that knowledge of that stuff. And you should only do what you have to do to increase your hit percentage, right? If I'm coaching Bryan and we're trying to shoot at a target 4,118 yards, you better believe I've got my stupid compass out and we're doing everything we can do. But if I'm coaching a guy or I'm in a match and I'm shooting a 4 MOA wide target with a 6 dasher at 500 yards, I'm not going to do anything except probably hold on the upwind edge unless it's blowing its butt off. Does that make sense? Hit percentage, mental mindset, don't suck, and use a bino or spotting scope to find the direction of the wind. That's about it, man. It's going to vary for whatever your application is.
So for questions, to get around to your question about where the wind matters.
Thank you.
Yeah, so there's a textbook answer to that, and then there's a real world answer that sometimes is different. So the textbook answer is based on a constant wind for the entire trajectory, like 10 mile an hour crosswind. In the case of a steady static wind for the whole trajectory, the wind near the shooter is the most influential, right? Because it influences the trajectory early on and it spends the entire time of flight on a deviated path from the beginning. Whereas if you only apply a wind over the very end of the trajectory, there's much less time to act on the trajectory. Yes, it's slower there and potentially more influenced by wind, but angularly, if you've only got 200 yards to go, you're not going to miss by as much as if you were deflected in the first 200 yards of a 1,000-yard shot. So textbook answer is the wind near the shooter matters most. In the real world, the wind doesn't blow constantly across your line of sight all the way to the target. Sometimes you're shooting from a sheltered position, you're in a tree line, something is shielding the trajectory from wind for so far until the bullet gets, say, out over a canyon or something where it's now exposed to potentially huge crosswind. So where the wind affects your trajectory the most is really a question of terrain and topography and how that wind is making its way through there as a fluid. And for that, I would say you're always looking for rules of thumb, right, to make it easy. Like, what's a policy that I can take to the field? And unfortunately with wind, there isn't really a fixed policy of, oh, just look at the wind a third of the way to the target. There is no fixed policy for that because you're always shooting over different terrain, right? So the really only policy that you can take to the field as far as a rule of thumb is to be flexible and open-minded about the environment that you're in and try to connect the cause-effect loop for what you're seeing there, because it might be different from what it was at home. And so that's a way to think about wind influencing the trajectory at different ranges. Another thing about, a common question about wind is wind speed or direction more important? All right, it's a simple question to ask, but I'm going to say it's not a well-phrased question, right? A lot of questions about shooting come across as black and white, this or that, when really a better way to ask these questions is, under what circumstance does this matter? And do those circumstances apply to me? And so for wind speed and direction is a good case of this, because, so I'll illustrate with a constant, I'll hold the wind speed constant, right? 10 miles an hour. We're dealing with a 10 mile an hour wind. Now, if you imagine that wind traversing 60 degrees from 2 o'clock through full value, 3 o'clock out to 4 o'clock, all right, you've got full value wind minus 13% by going off angle a little bit, okay? So full value to minus 13, you've got a 13%, that's a 1.3 mile an hour wind bracket if it's full value going from 2 to 4 o'clock. So that's very insensitive to direction, right? You went 60 degrees, 2 hours on the clock face, and only changed your wind bracket 13%. Now, if you take that same directional bracket, but put it from 11 to 1 o'clock, all right, so now you're crossing zero. So you've got a 50% left wind to a 50% right wind. Now your bracket is plus or minus 5 miles an hour. You have a 10 mile an hour bracket if you're crossing zero with that same wind direction change as if you're going 60 degrees across full value. So that's a way to think of, does the wind speed or direction matter more? Well, if it's a fishtailing head or tail wind, direction is what matters more because of the trig and how it breaks into components. If you're dealing with mostly a full value wind, it's going to be far less sensitive to those angular changes, but more sensitive to speed changes. So when you understand the components and how it breaks down, you can answer your own question about whatever your environment you're in, if you should be cued in more to speed or direction.
That's a really good way of explaining it, because that is usually the most dangerous wind, is that fishtailing headwind or tailwind.
Plus there's a time delay to it too.
Right, that's what I was going to say. So, if you're using, especially if you're using optics, like using Mirage to look at wind direction, right? There is a lag time with what you're seeing for Mirage. No matter what kind of scope you have, how much you spend on it, about the best you're ever going to be able to do is focus on the Mirage about halfway to the target. That's about all you can really do because of depth of field and everything else. Usually it's about a third of the way to the target. That's about what you're seeing typically, no matter how much you're adjusting those focus knobs for depth of field. So if I'm shooting in a headwind, I could have a direction change downwind and not see it in the Mirage. I'll see it after my bullet went through that wind. So it's like, it's like entering. Imagine you're in a starship and you enter in a new solar system, and you see what's going on at the planet. What you're seeing is like 4 light hours old, maybe, right? And they won't see what you're doing for like 4 hours, right? Because of the speed of light. It's the same thing with wind. Now, if the wind is coming from behind you, you may see an immediate change in the Mirage, a change of direction. But it has not filled in that entire depth of range. Think about all that air moving, right? So sometimes I'll apply like a like a walking or running pace to something. So like if the wind's like 8 miles an hour, you kind of know what like 8 miles an hour looks like if somebody's moving 8 miles an hour, right? Like your SHOT Show walk, get out of my way, I've had enough, you're about 3.5 to 4 miles an hour, right? A light jog, about 6 miles an hour, right? Like a 6-minute mile, like which I'm incapable of doing, that's about 10 miles an hour, right? So if I see the wind change physically, I think to myself, how long would it take a guy to run that distance? So you can maybe time how much longer you have within a certain wind condition, or how much time delay you should, like if you can wait, if you see a wind change coming from the back of you, and you can wait, I would wait. Because the only metric that you can see is pretty much right in front of you. Wait for that wind to fill in the whole range, if you can. So, but those conditions are they're hard to shoot in. You know, and especially if you're shooting over a canyon and you can't see any inputs, like you can't see any mirage direction, just look behind you. Because you don't really see very much mirage unless you have proximity to the ground, right? So once you get off that hilltop, you really can't see mirage. But if you turn around behind you, if you have some flat ground behind you, you might be able to pick up a wind condition. In some types of terrain, you're doing well just to figure out which way it's blowing. Never mind half an hour on the clock or shooting an azimuth at the bloody boil. Like I've shot places in Idaho in the mountains and you're like, dude, if we could figure out if it's left or right, we'll be doing a good job.
So one more comment on wind, and we'll bring it back to deterministic and open it up for questions. So a level is absolutely essential for shooting long range, especially if you want to read the wind and learn how to do that. Without an instrument like a level to
indicate, if I'm a carpenter?
Even if you're a carpenter, I don't give a shit. Human eyeball can resolve plus or minus 3 degrees of cant uninstrumented, okay? So if you don't have a scope level on your gun, you're dealing with a 6-degree window of uncertainty. Each degree of cant is offsetting your horizontal impact 10 inches at 1,000 yards. All right, so that's plus or minus 30 inches. You've got a 60-inch, a 5-foot wind bracket at 1,000 yards before the wind even blows, if you're just relying on your eyeball to find vertical, right? So having a scope level is absolutely essential. I've shot a lot of matches where it was, not a lot where it was dead calm, but when I shoot matches that are dead calm, there's always a guy that comes off the line saying, hey, I was catching 9s and 8s out the left and right. That was a tricky wind condition, right? I couldn't even see it. Well, that guy doesn't have a level on his gun. That's exactly what it looks like if you're shooting in calm condition with no levels. Some shots break here, some break here, groups strung out just like it's wind. And so it's the bang for the buck, it's the cheapest thing you'll ever buy to put on your gun, and it's narrowing your wind bracket from 60 inches down to whatever your group size has to be at long range. All right, and even if you have a level on your gun, a very common error is when you're setting up for your first shot. All right, this is a bigger problem with semi-automatics and gas guns because you don't have to come out of the scope and you can get a quick follow-up shot. Is, you know, you do everything right, you dope the wind, you look at your level, you send that first shot perfectly, goes just off right edge. Immediately you shift aim, hold left edge, send it, but you didn't slow down and verify that your level was correct. Now you're 2 feet off left edge and you're chasing your tail. So having the level on the gun is good, using it is even better, especially when you're in a hurry. So with some disciplines, this doesn't matter. Short range bench rest, I don't even know if they use levels, probably doesn't matter, it's only 100 yards. The reason you get horizontal spread in your group from canting errors is because of the amount of drop that you're correcting for, right? If you've got 300 inches of drop and you misdirect a little bit of that left or right because you've got cant, that's where that comes from. So flat shooting rifles or distances over which your trajectory is still flat is not going to be highly sensitive to it, but the further out you go becomes very critical. And that is one of the things that you have control of, right? You don't have control of how the wind blows, you've got to do your best to manage it, but you do have control of that level. And it's good whenever you use it. It will increase your hit percentage. So that's, we'll open it up to questions now. Any questions on anything we've talked about or anything at all?
It's easy, right?
They all got it.
They all got it. All right. All right. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate you guys coming here. Just everybody is aware, Capstone, these are all the brands, if you look up here, that we represent. We're the sole importer and distributor of Lapua and Vitavori in the United States, as well as SK. So that's the Lapua rimfire, SK rimfire, the Lapua cartridge cases and cartridges and bullets, and Vitavori powder. And in Berger, we make bullets and ammunition down in Mesa, Arizona. So feel free, we've got some new products, I think, in just about all the brands. So check it out. If you have any questions, we're here to help. Thank you very much.